Hi, thank you for tuning in today. Welcome to NGA's webinar on strategies for advancing equity through state education budgets during and beyond COVID. My name is Seth Gerson, and I'm Program Director for K-12 Education at NGA. And today I'm honored to engage in a conversation with four national experts on education finance. First, we have Mike Griffith, Senior Researcher and Policy Analyst at the Learning Policy Institute. For more than 20 years, Mike has worked with policymakers in all 50 states to help them reshape their school funding system through the lens of student achievement and educational equity. His research work has focused on the condition of state and district budgets, the adequacy and equity of state finance formulas, and promising practices in funding programs for high-needs students. Next, we have Dr. Marguerite Rosa. Dr. Rosa is Research Professor and Director of the Edunomics Lab, a research center focused on exploring and modeling education finance policy and practice. She leads the McCourt School of Public Policy's Certificate in Education Finance, which equips participants with practical skills in strategic fiscal management, finance policy analysis, and financial leadership. Dr. Rosa's research traces the effects of fiscal policies at the federal, state, and district levels for their implications on resources at the school and classroom levels. Third, Dan Thatcher is a Senior Fellow of Education at the National Conference of State Legislatures. Dan has worked with state legislators for more than 15 years, including covering education finance issues for NCSL since 2006 and providing legislative testimony in more than 10 states. And Jonathan Travers is a partner at Education Resource Strategies, which along with Education Trust leads the Alliance for Resource Equity. Jonathan leads the consulting practice at ERS and works with districts to analyze and improve resource use across systems. Before joining ERS, Jonathan was Vice President of Finance and Administration at Teach for America and served as Budget Director for the DC Public Schools. Dan, let's get started with you and dive right into the conversation. If you could set the stage for us, please share what you're seeing as the state of play for state education budgets across the country. What are you seeing as the primary trends?
Hi, Seth, and thank you, NGA, and to Seth for having this webinar and for having NCSL participate in it. It's a pleasure to be here. This has been a state of play that has been in flux since the pandemic first came to the United States. Last spring, as schools were closing and the economy was closing down, there was concern, and it was manifested in some of the revenue projections we were seeing out of states that we would be seeing declines in state budgets unprecedented since the Great Depression. Fortunately, what happened at the end of summer, though, is that we saw a lot of the sales tax revenue that the prior projections were based on were outperforming those projections, in part because of the remote sales tax that was being collected in some of the states. And this goes back to a U.S. Supreme Court decision a few years ago, the Wayfair v. South Dakota case that allowed states to collect remote sales tax. So this kind of came as a boon to some of the states as more and more consumers were spending money on Amazon and other remote retailers. So going into the fall, things were looking a little bit better. As the vaccine rolled out in the end of 2020, then the picture got even better. And as we head into this year, and as states are making their budgets, we've looked at the proposals from governors and the actual budgets from state legislatures and looking at the responses from our legislative fiscal staff. States are in a lot better position than they were last early summer, late spring. By one count, there's about 19 states that are making cuts as we speak to education for their fiscal years coming ahead. Many more had to actually make some cuts for the current fiscal year. And by one projection that NCSL had accumulated from survey responses from legislative fiscal staff, the average decrease in state budgets across the country, and again, this is an average, was about 10 to 11%. So some states there were 20% and even higher, and then some states just below 1%. And then some states actually, their revenues performed better than they did last year. And but then really the point is, moving forward, we're expecting things to look a little bit better. The other big question mark here is that Americans are saving more than they really ever have before because of the pandemic. And by one description of it from S&P, they refer to it as a large stimulus that's about to go into the economy, not of federal or government dollars, but of consumer savings going into the economy. So if that pans out, then perhaps we can have a better than hoped for projections at state revenue level. But again, this is entirely and completely dependent on how the pandemic plays out. And one thing we've learned over the last year is that there are many unforeseens, and anyone who lives by the crystal ball ends up eating glass. So there's so many caveats to this, but these are just some things to think about and consider as we move forward.
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate you setting the stage for the conversation. And Mike, I think at this point, if we could turn to you and think about maybe the broader context a little bit, take a step back. How have states historically responded in similar recessions? What are some of the lessons learned, and what's different about this time, and how should governors and states adjust their planning and strategies accordingly?
So yeah, it's very different, as I think we all kind of know at this point. That you think about the recessions of the early 80s, early 90s, and the Great Recession. Very similar in a lot of ways. You saw state revenue decline for the most part. You saw state funding to education decrease. In wealthier communities, we saw local property tax increase to offset that. And so we started to see this pretty big separation between the haves and the have-nots. And it's a cycle we've gone through in this country. During down economic times, state funding drops, local funding increases, the separation grows greater. A lot of worry at the beginning that we were going to see a similar cycle here. As Dan was talking about, the initial projections at 20% budget cuts, 30% budget cuts in states would have been devastating and would have been far beyond what we saw in the Great Recession. But we haven't seen that. And what we've seen is there was some initial pullback by states, some initial cuts that were made, but in a lot of cases, they've kind of gone back and filled those in. That doesn't mean every state's doing great, as Dan kind of said. There's a variation here. And if you're overly reliant on energy revenue or travel and tourism, you're still hurt really badly, and you're still looking at some fairly sizable budget cuts. But 40 to 45 of the states are doing okay budget-wise. But that's only part of the issue. And this is where it differs from the other recessions that we've seen. Is there's kind of three things that we talk about at the Learning Policy Institute with this current recession. It's the budget cuts, it's the short-term cost of COVID, and it's the long-term cost of COVID. The budget cuts, obviously, Dan talked about. The short-term costs are getting schools open. So that's PPE, that's cleaning, that's the cost of additional substitutes and social distancing. But the big one, the really expensive one, is the long-term cost. And the long-term cost is the lost learning time for students. And we're still trying to get a handle on what that is. I've seen some studies that talk about 1 month to 3 months. I've seen studies that say 7 months. Regardless, that's going to cost states and districts a lot of money to make up that difference. And to provide those services for kids, especially our highest need kids. So we've looked at it at LPI, and if you talk about simply extending the school year by 1 month for all students, it's about $36 billion. If you talk about a high quality tutoring program for students, for just 25% of your students, and that would be a 5-to-1 tutor ratio for students for an entire year to help them catch up. For just 25% of your students, that's about $37 billion. So we're talking some pretty hefty price tags. And it's going to take years to make up this difference. Also, what we've seen is, although it was slow in the beginning, is we've seen the federal government stepping up here. During the Recovery Act, depends on the numbers you look at, but it's about $90 billion that went to K-12 education. And that was sort of early, it wasn't sort of early, it was early in that recession. The initial federal package was $13.2 billion that went to K-12, which is significantly smaller during this downturn. We got another package in December that was about $54 billion. So even those two together, still not as much as the Recovery Act. But if the current federal legislation passes, and the current Recovery Act, it would provide about $130 billion. So we're talking the largest single federal investment in public education. Taken all together, that would mean the feds provided $200 billion to public education, which is about $4,000 per student. So tremendous investment if this gets put through, and a tremendous amount of help provided to states and school districts. So yeah, and one of the things is we're still in the midst of this. And as Dan said, we're still trying to figure this out, right? And what is the learning loss? Will schools open at the end of, in the next couple of months? Will all of them open come, the fall? All of these are variables we're still trying to figure out.
Thanks, Mike. And I appreciate you laying out not only the threat of the budget cuts, but also the short and long-term risks that are present and to be thought about, the challenges involved. Jonathan, I want to turn to you because, Mike talked a little bit about the state challenges. I know a lot of the work you do is more at the district level. Are you seeing similar challenges at the district level, issues of learning loss, social emotional learning, and what are you seeing as sort of the impact at the district level on students and programs and services, and how can governors and states support districts right now to mitigate those challenges? You're on mute.
Thanks for that question. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I want to offer to this sort of state level conversation a district perspective here. We work with lots of districts across the country, largely large urbans, higher needs districts, countywide. So that's very much my vantage point in this conversation. One of the things that we do at ERS was we run these 3 CFO strategy networks with CFOs of large districts across the country. Having myself now been part of the vast majority of the last 20 budget cycles, going back now a ways, either as a practitioner or as an advisor, this upcoming cycle stands out for me in 2 big ways. And actually, when we talked about this with our CFOs, this was unique for this upcoming cycle, unique for them across the board. We've added 1,000 on this in 2 different respects. So first is around uncertainty. So this is the most uncertain budget cycle that I've seen in the last 20 years, and that our CFOs have said that they have experienced. It's uncertain in 3 regards. It's uncertain in terms of overall revenue. As Dan was saying, it's trending better than we thought it might be. But now I think we're looking at a huge range of possible revenue levels moving forward. There's huge uncertainty around student need. So Mike, you talked a little bit about learning loss. We've got a paper out on this, The Full Cost of COVID, that lays out a little bit of a methodology for getting our arms around learning loss in our systems that might be helpful in this regard. But for the vast majority of systems, genuinely don't know the magnitude and the nuances of the learning loss in their systems. They also don't know about enrollment. For many of our states, I know that there's a revenue relationship to enrollment. There is also just a planning and cost relationship to enrollment. Many of our larger systems saw drops of 4 to 8% in aggregate, 10 to 20% in kindergarten. Are those kids going to come back? Are some of those kids going to come back? For the most part, we don't know. And then also significant uncertainty simply around service delivery and cost structure. Are we going to come back with 3-foot requirements or 6-foot requirements next year? Are we going to have transportation differential spend? If we don't know our student need, we actually don't really have our arms around service delivery on how we need to organize schools and schooling to meet the needs of our students. So really a unique moment of uncertainty in this upcoming budget cycle. One of the things that I think states can do is just to help manage that uncertainty. So certainly, let's not make it worse. Let's not box our districts into using resources in specific ways when we actually don't really have our arms around what we can do or what we should do. Let's not box this in too soon. And second, let's just be transparent about what we'll get increasingly certain about and when. The second thing that is unique about this year that we are now batting 1,000 on across our 40 CFOs is non-recurring revenue. So in each of my districts, a larger share of this next year's revenue will be non-recurring than it has been at any point in our CFOs' careers. Really important to make good, thoughtful decisions about what to do with non-recurring revenue. And I think there is an important opportunity and obligation for states, first, not to make it worse, but second, to help counsel, help support, create process that helps districts just make good, responsible choices with the non-recurring revenue. That's just going to be such a huge part of this budget cycle and next as well. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jonathan. And you mentioned the cost of COVID report, and we'll definitely include that in materials that go out as part of the webinar. But a lot of interest right now from governors' offices on learning loss. If you could just walk through just a couple of overview points of how governors' offices, state policymakers should think about measuring out some of the learning loss, just to unpack that a little bit for listeners.
Yeah, as we think, so this is coming up very much as districts are thinking about, okay, we're getting this mass infusion of ESSER money. Oh, what are we going to do with it? We've got to ground that in some conception of learning loss. So there are, and we're a little bit shorthanded here, I know, because we've missed a year of state assessments, and don't know what's going to happen across all states moving forward. But if districts can use the information that is available to them, whether that's attendance, whether that's student engagement, whether that's formative assessments, NWEA and curriculum associates, iReady, there are instruments that are out there. If we can get sort of little pinpricks or samples of data within our system, can we then extrapolate from those using national research prior to pandemic, just sort of crosswalk into broader learning loss assumptions for our district overall for specific student groups? And then if we are talking about, half of our kids are going to be between 4 and 8 months, and another half is going to be between 8 and 18 months, then we can start to have a conversation, sort of like what Mike was saying, about intervention, about extending school day, about tutoring, in ways that actually connect to research and impact sizes. Obviously, lots of extrapolation, but just for simple planning purposes, can we see, if we're talking about a year of learning loss, we know that that's not going to be a single year thing to solve. That's going to be a multiple year thing. That's not going to be tutoring by itself. So can we, and there's a whole other conversation to have about social emotional needs as well. But if we can start to lay out the contours of learning loss in our system, then we can bring to bear thinking about interventions and service delivery, and then we can get to cost. So sort of 3 steps.
Thanks, Jonathan. Very helpful. And I think this is a good segue for Marguerite, talking a little bit about, Jonathan mentioned the interventions and meeting social emotional needs, learning loss. As a governor's office, a state policymaker, how would you recommend prioritizing these investments? What do you see as providing the so-called most bang for the buck given COVID priorities? And how do you see different states and districts viewing these budget priorities, particularly difference between those that have already reopened schools and those that have not?
First and foremost, I'll say it's like we can't have this conversation unless we take stock of where each state is. So there seem to be there's not a single trend, there's many trends, but one of the most important in this moment is whether your schools are predominantly open or predominantly remote. And I think your challenges that are laid out in front of you are very different in those 2 scenarios. So first of all, if you're primarily remote, your schools are probably sitting on some cash, actually. They haven't spent as much money on substitute teachers and utilities and transportation and things like that, and they may have some money in the bank. If your schools are predominantly open, they've been spending money at a rate they've never seen before, with more subs as teachers go out on 14-day quarantines and things like that, and trying to kind of patch and create all these different systems to operate them. So they're in very, there are schools that are strapped right now because they are serving everybody in person, and ones that are predominantly remote. Now, here's the deal. If you're remote, there's some issues coming down the pike at you. For one, the cost of remediation is getting worse every day because you're still adding to the problem. And so I think what we're seeing is the schools that are open are already working on remediation. They're already taking stock of their learning losses. They're already adding days to their calendar or putting plans in for the summer. The ones that are predominantly remote, they're not talking about that yet at all. For the most part, they're just talking about opening, and that is a consuming discussion. It's negotiating with your labor partners. I mean, I'm on the West Coast, and so for those of you who are on the West Coast, the schools near me have a padlock around them. People are not going in and out yet, and that is their first order of business. So as far as financial priorities go, I would say, if you're looking at schools that are mostly closed, the first, or in remote, your priority is to get them open and stop the learning loss. That's a tricky priority. Turns out states have not had much luck funding incentives to reopen. That it's just not working. And California is a perfect example of that. And we're seeing that in a few places. We've seen some more success with states withholding money, and that was earlier on. So we're holding unless you open. But even now, I think so much time has gone by. I'm not sure that financial carrots or sticks will work right now on the reopening thing. But that is the first order agenda. It's also an incredibly important agenda because it fuels another competing financial pressure, which is enrollment loss. So the longer the schools are in remote mode, and the more they're talking about being remote come fall, the more parents are fleeing. And the enrollment loss is incredibly financially disruptive to districts. So what I would say, and we want to, states will want to balance this. How do we protect the district from financial losses associated with enrollment loss, but also make sure that money is there for remediation, right? Because if we use it just to kind of backfill our budgets, eventually that ends. And then we're eventually going to have to make some of these hard trade-offs, and it means we'll have less money to do the remediation. So I want to echo what Jonathan said, is the money needs to be really flexible right now. And I think it needs to have the incentives that that if you have a loss of students, that you're redirecting your staff to remediation. You're not just leaving your staff in classrooms teaching half-empty classrooms come the fall, that you're redirecting those resources. And we've seen some deliberation going on in states with that. I think you also want to avoid any sort of state incentives to hire new permanent staff. It's another thing you've heard several times here, is that the money is not permanent, it's temporary. And there's a thing that's very disruptive for districts, and that's layoffs. So if they hire a bunch of new staff this coming year, and at the end of the year they have to lay them off, you're sending districts into another state of financial chaos that they can't manage. So if you're hiring staff, they ought to be temporary and clearly temporary. You may be better off using the staff you have to pay for extra weeks of school, or doing stipends for tutoring and that kind of stuff. And that all goes to this sort of pace yourselves thing, because Mike mentioned $4,000 per pupil. That's a level of infusion of money we haven't seen before. And those of us who were around in the last recession remember the dreaded cliff, the financial cliff, and it was dreaded. So we've got to really pace ourselves and think about these long-term impacts. And the last thing I would say is, you just get a spreadsheet out and look at the financial implications for all of your districts. Are your policies hurting your highest poverty districts, or are they advantaging some districts or the others? You can just look across those numbers. That spreadsheet's going to matter a lot right now.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Marguerite. Really helpful, and especially thinking about it in this context matters. The scenario that you're in, where are you in the reopening conversation? Also, filtering that through as to what your priorities will be and how to think about the competing ones, and where to choose the best interventions. Turning centrally, and I think you touched on this, but turning centrally to questions of equity, what advice do you have for governors in states that want to address inequities amplified by the pandemic, both now and over the next few years? You mentioned incentives and some of what has worked or it has not worked? Is there a way for states to provide flexibility but still incentivize districts to fund equitably and sustainably over this time?
Yeah, I think that's where you get that spreadsheet out of all your districts. And we saw this in the last recession, that some of the changes states made really exacerbated inequities in their states. And we can't make that mistake again. So you need the spreadsheet of all your districts, what their sort of mix of students is, how high poverty and stuff, and what your changes will do to those districts. So if you're contemplating putting some sort of financial hold harmless policy in place, look to see what the financial impact of that is going to be in the short and the long term. If you're thinking about making changes to your local dollars, do the same thing. But last recession, another big thing that happened is, even as we came out of the recession, districts had to kind of absorb with the cliff. They had to absorb these reductions in their revenues, and the layoffs started happening as the rest of the economy was recovering. And the layoffs really disproportionately hurt our highest poverty schools inside districts. So this is another chance to sort of say, as we look ahead, and we do know that we'll have districts with financial impacts, do we need to make sure that our policies are in place that protect the higher poverty schools inside those districts as well, either from seniority-based layoffs or other kinds of things where they're taking the brunt of the cuts that might be coming down in the years to come.
Seth, can I just piggyback on that? I totally agree, and would amplify one piece of this, that the last recession was not accompanied by massive learning loss. And I think the lessons from last time, I think, are incredibly instructive, but implicit in what Marguerite is saying, I think, is this recognition that that victory is not going to be creating level funding. Like that is actually going to be a loss. Like, we're going to have to do something in this next 2 or 3 years that is informed by what happened a decade ago, but also adjusts for the fact that, adjusts for the asymmetry of learning loss that we're experiencing across our districts right now.
Yeah, appreciate that, Jonathan. That's a good addition and amplifies the message. Dan, I want to turn back to you. You started us off by giving us some of the trends. You're in regular ongoing conversations with state legislators. What insights do you have for governors, other state policymakers seeking to create and move forward a budget that does not disproportionately impact the most vulnerable students during this time?
Yeah, well, I like the way that Mike framed this in looking at the immediate needs, the short-term needs, and the needs for the long haul. And that may be a good way to characterize some of the questions we've been getting and some of the concerns that we're hearing. And we've already talked about the enrollment loss and the declines, and that can be a pretty immediate need and discussion for state legislatures right now. In fact, the number one question we're getting from state legislatures is about this question and whether to put a hold harmless into place. What should they be counting students differently? Some states will count an average of attendance, some will count an average of actual enrollment or membership. And so these are questions to be asked. But again, it's critical that when making these decisions, to look at where the student population is in your state and how any decision would impact our most vulnerable students and communities. And the lens that we've often used to identify these vulnerable student populations has been low income, and oftentimes that's been determined by eligibility for free reduced priced meals. And maybe we need to rethink that too. There's also communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and that could go into this analysis as well. I've heard one analyst say that we need more data, better data now, and we need this data to identify where student enrollment drops are happening and respond accordingly. So that's one area. And by the way, I ran the numbers for the last 20 years on aggregate for the United States. The average enrollment changes is a positive 0.2%, 0.29%. And so that's over 20 years for all the states. And now we're looking at anywhere from 2 to 4 to, as Jonathan mentioned, 8%. And 20% is in the kindergarten. I've been using this uncouth term, redshirting on steroids. And so legislatures need to be cognizant of the implications of the funding for these early grades and for where students are dropping off, and they tend to be dropping off too at the end of their school career in the 11th and 12th grade. And there's implications for community colleges and systems of higher education because of that. So that's kind of in the near term. Over the next couple of fiscal years, Jonathan also mentioned, and Marguerite had mentioned, the need for some flexibility at the local level. And here's where legislatures can play a pretty large role in looking at the statutory restrictions on budget reserves that districts have. Oftentimes there's a cap, 10%, 7% of operating budgets. And can they temporarily raise that to 20% or higher to house these revenues for the next couple of fiscal years looking ahead? Another restriction that's often in statutes is whether districts can carry over some of these reserve funds to the next fiscal year. So legislatures need to look at whether any of those statutes need to be temporarily waived or rewritten to allow more revenue and cash flexibility at the district level. And for the long haul, this is an opportunity for legislatures in states to not do harm, but actually to do make these policies that go to support students that are vulnerable, either because of their low income status or vulnerability due to the pandemic. One thing that we have seen is that because of what we've known from the Great Recession, when districts that had the local capacity to raise revenue in the absence of state aid, they did, and it exacerbated the inter-district inequities in the state. So being sensitive to where there is local revenue capacity at the local level, can states rework their funding formulas to be more sensitive to those the varying capacity at the local level to raise revenue, and also to be sensitive to where these populations are that need further resources than the average student, perhaps. So my hope is that we come out of this with more equitable funding systems at the state level, and we have already systems that are more responsive and more quickly and timely to the needs of the districts. And I will say, before the pandemic, one of the biggest questions we were getting from legislatures was how to introduce into their funding formulas additional weights or money or categorical funding for students who are living in poverty or who are low income. And that interest is certainly carried over into the pandemic as well. So again, my hope is that our systems writ large are actually escape this more equitable.
Thanks, Dan. Really helpful and interesting to hear that those conversations that started pre-pandemic have continued into the pandemic, and whether those conversations and being able to talk to one another, the key stakeholders in a state, established at least some foundation for the ability and space for those conversations to occur. One of the most frequent questions we hear from governors' offices in the last number of weeks is how to plan both short and long term. And Mike, I want to turn to you on this, particularly given, and this has been mentioned a little earlier, the likelihood of a significant influx of new federal funding to help reopen schools in the coming weeks. How can governors, states, and districts maximize this funding to plan for both now and ahead? And how can they optimize funding over time so it's not just one-off spending, but a focus on those short and long-term goals? Again, the funding cliff was mentioned a little earlier as well. How do you avoid that? How do you try to sustain this funding over the long term? Thanks.
So, and I think you've heard this from Jonathan and Marguerite and Dan, and we're all worried that this is one-time money. It's a tremendous amount of one-time money, but it is one-time money. And it needs to be targeted and used correctly during this time. What states can start to do is communicate with districts about what are high quality programs, what are programs that have shown, the research has shown to help students make up for lost learning time. In some cases, that's going to be rethinking what your summer school programs are, what tutoring programs are, thinking about extended day, but trying to give them very clear guidance about this, also giving them clear guidance about, when can you spend this money, what can you spend it on, and not spending it on something, like hiring more teachers and providing pay raises, things that will have long-term consequences. And you can, with the federal dollars, you can provide guidance as a state, you can't mandate. But you can think about some of the things, and again, the others have all talked about this, as far as your state funding goes, try to remove some of the restrictions, try to provide some clarity about where it can go, what places can do. If you have funding for different programs, maybe loosen those rules right now to allow for them, because the biggest things coming up, and you keep hearing this theme over and over from all of us, is learning loss and student counts. Those are huge. Either one of which is gigantic. Both of them together, we're still trying to grapple with. So I think the more guidance they can provide about research ready programs, research proven programs, I think will be great. And then guidance and really letting them know, pump the brakes on this. You do not have to spend this money by the end of this school year. It is much better to wait to the next school year, have a plan in place, and talk about how you're going to use these federal dollars with local dollars and state dollars to help achieve goals. My concern is we did see that with the Recovery Act, where places got the money and felt they needed to spend it immediately. It was a little different with the recovery during the Great Recession, because a lot of states and districts were just filling budget holes. This is different though. This isn't meant to fill budget holes. This is meant for some specific targeted programs to help the kids who are most needy.
Thanks, Mike. And I appreciate you talking about a key governor role is sort of holding up high quality programs, right? And really being able to showcase some of the district innovation, school innovation that we know is happening right now, and how to address some of these critical issues. Just for our listeners, governor's offices in particular, we will be releasing, along with the Council of Chief State School Officers, a resource that looks at different models and what's working and what do we know right now as some high quality programs next month. So in addition to support we're already doing, want to make sure that they know that that's coming, those who will be listening to this call. Jonathan, I want to turn to you and go back to resource equity. I know this is an issue you've studied for many years. Where do you see the opportunities and challenges for addressing inequities at the state and district level during COVID, given your experience and expertise? You're on mute.
2 for 2. Let me get pretty specific in terms of the evolutions in service delivery we think are both possible now and important. But just to set the stage, we define a resource equity to be the allocation and use of resources, which we define as people, time, and money, to create student experiences that enable each student to reach empowering and rigorous outcomes, no matter race or income. So there's lots of sort of nuance in that language. One important part of the message here is that it is both about how much and how well, what we're doing with the resources that we have in service of each student's unique needs. We've got, just a quick resource, we've got with EdTrust, the Alliance for Resource Equity, a whole toolkit and that lays out what we see as the 10 dimensions of resource equity, 10 dimensions of student experience that are most important from a research perspective, and then also have a diagnostic that's part of that toolkit that helps districts or communities understand the resource equity picture across their schools and their system more broadly. Here's our theory of the case for next year, that this learning loss is obviously not going to play out evenly across all students, all classrooms, all schools. And that sort of there's going to be a sprinkling on top of a much wider distribution of student need within classes. Also a lot of transients and attendance issues, students coming in and out. We think that that is going to require being much more deliberate and systematic about differentiating time and attention across students and groups of students than we've needed to do, than we've done in the past. I would argue that we've needed to do that all along. We are going to need to do it even more so now. So there is an opportunity for rethinking classes and sort of rethinking service delivery that is much more nuanced on providing some students much more attention, different students attention on different things at different times than there was before. The interesting thing is that this year, we as a field, I think, have learned to do that and have built an infrastructure to do that very quickly in ways that didn't exist before. So there are learning management systems now across all the districts that we work in. There are opportunities for online learning we're now one-to-one in ways that didn't exist at exactly 365 days ago. So that's, I think, an interesting opportunity. We're going to be publishing sort of a whole toolkit on how we can think about incorporating lessons from this past year into service delivery moving forward. But this whole idea of differentiating time and attention, I think, is going to be a really important part of what it means to create resource equity for students moving forward. Last thing I'd say on this is, from a state policy level, there can often be, not all states, but in some states, a triumvirate of state policy around class size, seat time, and teacher of record that really reinforce and create class by class by class by class mode of service delivery that I think is actually going to run counter to what we think effective practice is going to look like moving forward.
Thanks, Jonathan. And we'll include, listeners, the toolkit that Jonathan spoke about, as well as his paper from a number of years ago on resource equity. One thing, if I recall, Jonathan, in the paper you did, I think it was pre-pandemic, but there was a section on social emotional needs. And I think we've talked a lot about learning loss. Some are looking at that as more academic. A number of our governor's offices are looking at both the academic side and holistic needs together. If you could just draw out just a quick overview of how that resource equity paper or your own findings about during this COVID time, the social emotional needs of students and how to attend to that during the time.
Yeah, well, really briefly, you can think about social emotional needs and learning as a little bit of a pyramid. So at the top, absolutely, there is a subset of kids and a growing set of kids who need direct treatment, who have serious issues that are going to need, social emotional supports, counseling, and so on. The foundation of that, though, we see as student-adult relationships. And this is, I think, the opportunity for the field, K-12 moving forward, is really making sure that we're designing master schedules, we're designing our staffing in schools in ways that really anchor, that foster meaningful relationships between students and adults for all kids. From there, yes, we'll narrow to think about social workers and counselors and all that stuff as sort of extra resources. But I think one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough in this space of social emotional wellness is that teacher-student relationship and the role, frankly, of master schedule and staffing, the role of that in enabling those relationships.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I want to now turn to you and Marguerite, ask both of you around one of the key aspects, also the governors, right? The communication aspects with key stakeholders across the state. So as we're thinking about strategies for communicating budget impacts and changes to parents and families, the public, and what these changes mean for students and teachers in schools, what are some strategies you've seen for being able to communicate that? And we can start with you, Jonathan, then we'll move to Marguerite as well.
Yeah, Marguerite's done great research on this. So let me just be brief on this. the messaging, I think, can be different for different constituencies. We do think that grounding in the why is important. So if we're making this change, what is our theory? What is the theory of the problem that we're trying to solve with it? Number one. Number two, what does it mean for actual student experience? So inertia will pull toward reduced class size and potentially extending time. Margaret's done a bunch of work on messaging on class size. I think that's probably not the right answer for us in this moving forward. So we've got to be clear about messaging on what we're trying to accomplish with that, with the investment, in terms of what it means for what students will actually experience. The other quick things I'd say on this is that there is a do now, build toward concept in communication. We are taking this action now in service of a longer term change that moves toward this future state, number one. And then number two, we've got to connect trade-offs towards investments. We are not we are reallocating from this so that we can do this, do that.
Thanks, Marguerite.
Yeah, I'll get to messaging in a second, but I think at the risk of being blunt, I'm going to say a few blunt things. We need to get the students back sooner rather than later. And I worry that those who put off the bringing kids back to the fall will spend the better part of the fall readjusting to have kids back who haven't been back in a year, in a year and a half, who've never been to high school before, but they're, sophomores. Last time they were in the middle of 8th grade. I mean, that's a big adjustment. It'll be adjustment for the staff and it'll be adjustment for the kids. So number one, we've got to get our kids back. And number two, to be really blunt, don't go invest all this money in reducing class sizes. So say that again, don't go invest all this money in reducing class sizes. And the reason I'm being really blunt there is that doesn't add any learning time to kids, and they've missed a lot of learning time. It's good, the inertia, the districts are not particularly nimble. I work with a lot of districts too, and they know this. They're, mired in labor contracts. The really easy thing to do is going to be fund what they have. They have fewer kids there. That's basically going to translate to just an investment in smaller class sizes. I don't think that's going to meet the moment. We see a lot of district leaders coming and joining our certificate in ed finance just to figure out how to go forward. But they're reporting the pull of just reducing class sizes or adding more adults to the building. We have to increase the learning time for kids. And that's going to be thinking about something differently than we have done for the last, 20 years. Kids don't have any more learning time in normal operation than they did in the past. And we've got to increase that, if more weeks, more hours. And I guess I would say for those who are having trouble reopening, the next big agenda is how do we get our students back, right? A lot of these families aren't coming back even if we open the schools. And I don't think we can wait till they come back to start the remediation. I think we've got to figure out if there are online tutoring pods. I think Amplify runs something with this, maybe 3 to 5 kids and 1 teacher. There's a software that they use. And you have to start this now. I don't think you can say, all right, let's get the kids back and then we'll take stock of remediation come next October or November or December. I think the remediation has to start right now. So I think if I was the state, I would say, here's your money. Show me the additional learning time the kids are going to get. That's what the trade has to be. It could take a lot of forms. It could be really flexible, but that has to be our essential negotiation there. And that's going to get wrapped up in all these hold harmless policies, because the hold harmless policies are really about protecting districts. This is my segue into the messaging. We can't just be protecting districts or protecting teachers from layoffs or protecting custodians or bus drivers from later. We've got to be focusing on the students, and the parents are hyper aware that you haven't been talking about kids lately, that we've been hold harmless is about protecting districts or things like that, or staff. We need to be able to say what the money does for students. And a lot of times we assume it's shorthand, right? We gave out this raise or this hazard pay because our teachers really deserve it. They've been working hard. All of that's true. But if we can't show some benefit for students, and we can't say it out loud and finish that sentence, because our teachers are doing the long hours of work that are addressing the students' need every single day, or chasing kids down to get them back enrolled in school, or reaching out to students that haven't signed up and logged on for a week. I think we need to finish that sentence to sort of remind everybody what that money is buying for kids. So the discipline has to be, if you can't finish the sentence in what it means for students, then it probably isn't money that people are going to hear that's well spent on behalf of kids.
Thanks, Marguerite. And I appreciate your earlier comments around this sort of constant toggle that the governors are doing between knowing the importance of in-person instruction, at the same time trying to make sure that students and staff come back in a safe way, and some of the 6 feet requirements in the classes and how they need to be set up, being able to do that keeps students and staff safe. It's sort of that constant balancing that they're doing during this time. I want to stay with you a little bit, and I think we've mentioned student counts, learning loss, some of the social emotional needs throughout this discussion. But as you look ahead to the summer, the fall 2021 and beyond, what are you still most concerned about as you look at the fiscal landscape? And on the flip side, where are you seeing some bright spots and models for a path forward?
Among those, also, I'm worried that we're not going to be able to meet this moment, that we're going to fund things the way they've always been, and we're going to leave everything intact, and we're going to blame the kids. Not really, but if the learning outcomes aren't there, and we're going to look around and go, wow, we lost 5% of our kids. I wonder where they went. State, can you give me the money for those kids? Because this will be really disruptive for the district. And we won't have figured out how to either pivot some of those staffing positions to finding and tracking down and remediating students. And we're already seeing states doing this. There's just inertia at the state, there's inertia at the district level to kind of stay on the path that we've always done, to wait and see how this shakes out, to take the lead from others and doing that. But I'm optimistic about some of the efforts being done in districts that are back and operating. Some of them are adding already weeks to their calendar this year. Some of them are already we've seen this in Baltimore, these online tutoring pods going forward. We're very worried about reading in the K through 2 grade levels, that reading learning isn't happening. And we need to sort of address that right now. Going months without that reading, I think is very worrisome. But we are seeing some places that are already doing that and tapping some of their staff with stipends to reach kids in new and different ways for longer hours. And I think that's where we can take our lead from. That's got to happen sooner rather than later. I want to say a word about the labor contracts, and this is, sensitive territory to say anything about it, but the labor contracts are going to push more for a one-size-fits-all model, or a model that is, delay, or it takes a while to get to the other side. Obviously, labor matters enormously here. We don't solve this problem without labor. But this isn't a one-size-fits-all problem. Some of the kids we haven't heard from are at home homeschooling and learning quite a bit, and other ones may not be. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all situation laid out in front of us. And I think we may need to sort of accept that and allow individual schools to meet their conditions in different ways. And I hope we're going to give our schools and our principals and our teachers a little bit of space to do that without as much of the constraints that we've had in the past that are written into the labor contracts.
Thanks, Marguerite. Very helpful pinpointing some of the issues ahead in the next number of months and even beyond. I think just for this last few minutes, what I'd like to do is just do a round robin, and we'll start with you, Dan. Just what's some final advice as we head out here to governors and states as they create continue to move forward with state education budgets this legislative session?
Well, mine's actually maybe a little off from the budget part, but this comes from being married to an infectious diseases doctor who works in public health and having two sons in early grades. And that is, when it does come to reopening schools, governors and superintendents, I'm guessing most of them are not public health, don't have public health backgrounds. And so they need to look to who they have been getting their guidance and advice from for opening schools. And then they need to ask themselves, does that person have a background in public health? Is that person a doctor and qualified to give advice? And if not, then maybe get a second opinion from someone who is. So the short of it is that we have research, and there's a lot of research going all over the world on reopening schools and in education in the time of a pandemic. And it's coming out weekly. And so you need someone who's reading that research, knows how to interpret it, and knows how to make guidance on that, so that we can get our kids back in school as soon as possible, to Marguerite's point. And that we are making decisions that aren't based on gut feelings or politics, but actually on the science and on what the public health response should be to keep people safe and get students back into school.
Thanks, Dan. Mike?
So yeah, what mine would be, this is a time to measure twice and cut once. Take your time. We all want to get out there and change all the negative stuff that happened because of COVID right out of the bat. But for schools, you're better off if you take your time, if you use this summer to plan, to think about what you're going to do, so you can be ready. This isn't something we're going to solve, the lost learning time, the students that have moved out of the public education. It's not going to be done in 1 year. It's going to take 2 or 3 years to do. And it's better to take your time and do it right. And think about what that is, and bring in people from your districts and talk to them and train them about what is happening, what should they look for, and what can the state do to help them, help these students. We've never experienced this before. The only thing that's even close is something like a hurricane that comes in and knocks out a school district for a period of time. But even then, that tends to be for a couple of months. That's not for an entire school year plus, as Marguerite said. And it's nationwide, it's statewide, it's district-wide, and different kids are impacted in different ways, even kids who have similar backgrounds. So taking your time, understanding what these kids' needs are, where they're at, and then providing them with the services they need to get back on track. And the important thing is too, you still got to teach them as if it's a regular school year. So we're doing a regular school year plus for at least, I'd say, the next 2 years, but probably the next 3 years. So think about it that way. This is much more of a marathon than a sprint.
Thanks, Mike. Good words of advice there. Marguerite?
I admire you greatly, Mike. I'm going to say the opposite. The time piece as a parent, and you're watching these kids get older and older and miss so much of their development, their social emotional development, their academic development, the time worries me. I think the time is right now, and we need to start trying some things and do it sooner rather than later. I worry the planning every week that goes by is one. I mean, if you're hearing urgency in my voice, it's urgency on behalf of kids that I am every day goes by worried about, and they're getting a day older. I mean, this has been a very large portion of their life. So I would say, no, don't, start today. If that means you start doing reading remediation today, get that done. If we can reach out to kids we haven't heard from in a while, let's do that this afternoon. So that would be my thing. I do think there is no playbook really for this moment, and we're not going to get a perfect one, and our leaders are overwhelmed, and the district leaders that we know and interact with, even the principals, have a lot of competing forces coming at them and don't really have the capacity here. So I think, investing in the analytics and really developing the opportunity for the kinds of networks even that Jonathan runs and everything else for the district leaders to come together and share strategies and interact and sort of get their energy up to try a lot of things rapid fire in a really near term is going to matter. We've not invested in financial capacity in these systems. I mean, these districts, our team is trying to go figure out what their supplemental budgets look like, and many of them haven't posted it. And I've asked district leaders, are you sitting on cash or are you in the reserves right now? And there's just not a lot of information there. So I think we need to recognize the challenges we've given the district leaders, but also think about some of the support coming in to districts around their financial capacity. Because I'll be one on the sidelines saying, now, get it done now. So anyway.
Thanks, Marguerite. Well, that's what makes these discussions interesting, is different perspectives. So it's good to see as we go around. Jonathan, last to you.
Yeah, real quick. At ERS, we say it's not just how much, but how well. So I have a quick how much and a quick how well. The how much, again, really important to ground appropriation funding level conversations in some conception of student need and learning loss. However we're going to do it, however much we need to extrapolate and triangulate to do so, would really push for grounding funding conversations in something related to student need. On the how well side, this is something that I sort of put out there, not fully thought through, but folks are exhausted. There is going to be a real need, like a Maslow's hierarchy kind of need for comfort to returning to normal next fall. I think that runs counter to what we're going to need to do. And so while there is going to be this feeling of pulling toward returning to normal, going back to the old way, there is an imperative for recovery and redesign. And I think we, at the district level, we need state, we need state help in really pushing that notion of recovery and redesign and not return to normal. And maybe that there's a way of saying that this thing that we're doing is both of these things, but really want to push toward recovery and redesign. I do think that the state processes for around ESSA fund distribution and implementation may provide a vehicle for doing that we can create processes for districts in putting together ESSER spending plans that actually pull toward recovery and redesign in very explicit ways. So I would leave that there. We're going to put something out soon on sort of ESSA fund, ESSER for recovery and redesign, and so we can share that out with Seth when the time comes. But important that we're creating. Well, I think that this is a moment for using an ESSER process for recovery and redesign.
A good goal to have and a good way to end recovery and redesign. Let's aim for that and not just a return to normal. So great. Thanks to Mike, Marguerite, Dan, and Jonathan for the great conversation and sharing your insights today. Listeners, please note that all reports and resources discussed during this webinar will be attached to the recording once it's posted on the NGA website and shared out. So until next time, thanks for listening. We hope you and your family stay safe and well, and have a great day. Thanks.